Parables are not fables. They do not teach us a direct lesson that can be immediately applied to living a good life. Case in point, the parable of the dishonest manager. If I were giving awards for the most morally ambiguous parable, well, this one would be in the running. For starters, the issue is presented as of a dishonest manager, and that's who we're dealing with as the hero? And then the dishonest manager gets fired, but before the word gets out, he cancels some of the debt owed to the owner, presumably aiming to get hired by one of the debtors for his next gig. So he's dishonest, underhanded, and self-serving, and he gets commended both by the person who had fired him and used as an example of kingdom values by Jesus? This guy is our role model? Let no one say that the role of the preacher in interpreting the text for a modern audience is easy, but let's give it a try. First of all, I think we better have a decent sense of this story in its historical context so that we can read less into it and hear it more as the first hearers would have. Here is a redacted commentary from the social science commentary on the Synoptic Gospels. It is long. This parable is really confusing. Rich landowners frequently employed estate managers, often a slave born into the household, who had the authority to rent property, make loans, and liquidate debts in the name of the master. Such agents were usually paid in the form of a commission or fee on each transaction they arranged. While token under-the-table additions to loan contracts were common, all the principal and interest had to be in a publicly written contract approved by both parties. There is no warrant for the frequent assumption here that the agent could exact as much as 50% above a contract for his fee. If that had been done, the rage of the peasants would have immediately been known to the landowner, who would have been implicated in the extortion if he acquiesced. This is clearly not the case in this story. Traditional Israelite law provided that an agent was expected to pay for any loss incurred by his employer for which he was responsible. He could also be put in prison to extort the funds from his family. If the dishonesty of the manager became public knowledge, he would have been seen as damaging the reputation of the master. Severe punishment could be expected. Startlingly, however, in this story, he is simply dismissed. In the case of the dismissal of an agent, the dismissal was effective as soon as the agent was informed of it. And from that time forward, nothing the agent did was binding on the person who employed him. The plan worked out by the manager thus had to be enacted before the word of his dismissal got to the village. The scheme of the manager is to seek new patrons. The debtors here paid a fixed amount of the produce. The size of the debts is extraordinary. Although such measures are difficult to pin down, they are probably equivalent to 900 gallons of oil and 150 bushels of wheat. Storytelling hyperbole may be involved, or as recent investigations have suggested, debts are large enough that they may be the tax debts of an entire village. The rich man presumably has an interpersonal attachment to his manager. Having discovered the mercy of the landowner in not putting him in prison or demanding repayment, the manager depends on a similar reaction in the scheme he cooks up. It is a scheme that places the landowner in a peculiar bind. If he retracts the actions of the manager, he risks serious alienation in the village, where the villagers would have already been celebrating his astonishing generosity. If he allows the reductions to stand, he will be praised far and wide, as will the manager for having made the arrangement, as a noble and generous man. It is the latter reaction upon which the manager counts. Okay, so that's what happened in the story. And the more I read about Jewish peasants in Jesus' day, the more I am convinced that they were well aware of the systems of injustice that kept them down. I also find this to be true of people living in poverty today. And I'm not sure that there's an actual protagonist in this story, really. The rich man is definitely not seen as a good man in a society where wealth was assumed to be stolen. But the person whose job it was to enable the rich man's continued wealth accumulation was also not seen in a positive light. And many people I know can identify with the manager's mind. He was better off being a manager and getting a decent cut of the accounts he created than he was in most other positions that he was eligible for. But working for, in this case, the man whose very wealth oppressed others was also inherently dishonorable work, or at least the peasants would have seen it that way. And quite often, when I think too hard about what it means to work for the United Methodist Church, I fear it is inherently dishonorable work too, even though I believe working for this church is a moral good. And there are a lot of jobs like this. Working for the healthcare system, yay! Caring for people. But also making wealth for investors and insurance companies. Working in education, yay! Teaching people things they need to know. And also participating in a system that maintains income inequality over lifetimes. Great. Really, I think a lot of jobs, probably most jobs, in our society are morally ambiguous, given the fact that we live in a society that treats a large percentage of people as expendable, and the institutions and systems of society are part of how we maintain this system. Right in this moment, I feel like John Oliver when he talks about how incredibly cheery his show is. In the midst of the realities of income inequality, injustice, and violations of Jewish law comes this incredibly morally ambiguous parable. I think the way that I can most easily make sense of it is if the debts forgiven are the debts of the entire village. It brings the whole thing together, including that it suggests that the rich man owns the whole village, which was common enough in the Roman Empire, but inherently immoral in the tradition of the ancient Jews, who believed that every family got land access that could not be taken away from them. This is why they were against interest. The rich man owning the village means that all of the morals of the community have been deeply violated, and both the rich man and his obsequious servants are at fault. The post-firing actions of the dishonest manager have some accidental Robin Hood implications then. He cancels debt, creates a better balance, eases the lives of the people, but it's really pretty clear he does this for himself, and the benefit to the people is mostly accidental. And yet it has some themes that fit other parables and other teachings of Jesus. There's a value in cornering the rich man into being generous, in winning the shrewd fight, and in taking care of people no matter the intention. While I believe that the moral of the story is likely tacked on later, and the Jesus Seminar at least thinks that it does go back to Jesus, and I'm going to say that Luke placed it well. This is the moral. No servant can serve two masters. No doubt that slave will either hate one and love the other, or be devoted to one and disdain the other. You can't be enslaved both to God and a bank account. In the book Debt, the history of the first 5,000 years, it says that the world's major religions emerged in response and in counter to the world's first market economies. That is, there started to be an assumption that markets were good and defined what life should be, and those who won at the market deserved it, and those who lost at the market deserved it, and that was just how life should be. And in the face of that, religions said, nope. I would make a claim that the author didn't in that book, that this was related to the Spirit of God not being invested in the markets and the hierarchies that they create in valuing human life. But in a quite literal sense, religions countered the claims of the market. Money is not what matters most. Individual wealth is not a sign of a person's goodness. Instead, all people have value. Instead, goodness is related to the way all people are cared for. Instead, common good is the definition of a successful society. God cares for the peasants, even though the market does not. This morally ambiguous parable is likely not one we want to take as a simple role model story. But in the vein of great parables, it is one that invites us into consideration of our own lives and our own roles. When are we serving the rich man and harming the poor? When are we serving ourselves? And who is that helping and hurting? When are we serving the poor? And why? How are we implicated in systems that oppress? And how and when are we motivated to shake them up? And maybe, when are we backed into a corner, afraid for our own well-being? And when can we use that to find ways to help others along our journey? Serving God and not money is not encouraged in our society. I often fear that our economy is the actual God of our society. But the God of our Bible, the God we learn about from Jesus, is deeply invested in offering us alternatives to worshiping the economy. And thanks be to God for being worthy of our worship and being worthy of being the center of our lives. Amen.